Now, of course, when we talk about free speech, we're not only talking about speech, we're talking about both verbal and other forms of symbolic expression, such as words, written, images, photographs, artworks, television programs, films, and how they interact with external constraints, either formal ones such as the law or social constraints such as social conventions that you shouldn't say things in places or at particular times because they may cause harm or offense. So we're talking about really freedom of expression. And over the course of this module, I'll shift between talking about free speech and freedom of expression kind of interchangeably because we understand both of those terms roughly in the same way. But it's important to stress at the outset that we're talking about the full gamut of mediated forms of expression here. And the essence of the debate regarding free speech or freedom of expression is whether or not we should regulate the communication of ideas, thoughts, and beliefs. And going back to the first point that I made, that regulation might be formal, laws, or they may be social, such as social conventions that it's not appropriate to talk about particular people or depict particular people in particular ways at particular times because that is offensive to their cultural beliefs and that would cause groups in the population undue harm. So free speech is really about two things: the freedom of opinion and the freedom of expression. Now, freedom of opinion is in many respects the easy one here because we are all entitled to have opinions, but an opinion doesn't, in many respects, actually become an opinion until it finds expression. So until you say something, until you write something, until you depict something visually, your opinion in many respects doesn't exist. So that's why the idea at the core of the debate is really about freedom of expression. And free speech or freedom of expression is important because in an increasingly globalized world, particularly one that is connected by social media, which is both a kind of formal way of communicating, but also an informal way of communicating. So if we think about social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, they're this kind of bizarre and hybrid of formal ways of communicating and informal ways. It's kind of like sending a letter. Sometimes it's a bit like sending a letter, and at other times it's like a radio broadcast or a TV broadcast or printing something in a newspaper. So that hybridity and ambiguity around social media in particular in a globalized world means that we need to take how we protect speech and how we regulate speech very importantly because it's becoming an increasingly complex issue. And of course, that's not to say that freedom of expression or free speech was never not complex. Debates about free speech are a natural part of living in a democracy because democracy gets worked out through social interactions in many respects. And that has advantages. It means that we can adapt our laws to change circumstances, but it also has disadvantages in the sense that there's some important things, and we're going to see this over the course of this module, some very important things relating to how we deal with each other as people are not carved in stone. and that creates ambiguity and the potential for exploitation. So, as Ellerton in one of the readings for this week suggests, debates about free speech, discussions relating to free speech, produce a permanent state of angst. Where these are things that are constantly discussed and need to be discussed in order to be updated. Of course, they're more acute at the moment because extreme views, which were once low-key and on the margins of society, have become considerably louder. And over the course of the next few modules, we'll talk about the role of social media in contributing to that. But we also need to think about the rise of extreme right-wing views, not only in the United States through the most obvious example, Donald Trump, but in Australia and also in other countries such as the Philippines and nations in Europe as well. So these opinions, which were kind of pushed to the margins in the heyday, if you like, or the high points of the liberal democratic era, have now become considerably louder and considerably more forceful. So we need to factor these very significantly into our discussions regarding free speech. These, hate speech, extreme right-wing views are no longer abstract concepts. They're no longer extreme. They are becoming normal if they are not already normal. So freedom of speech is not just about liberty. It's not just about the idea that in a democracy we should be free to say and do whatever it is that we want. Now that's an important point to make at the outset. There are many laws which regulate speech. We spoke about some of them in relation to media ownership laws, Australian content laws. There are a whole series of media laws and regulations which we looked at previously in this unit that in many ways regulate and restrict speech. So the idea that this is an argument about liberty and being able to say whatever we want, whenever we want, is a little bit naive. Really, arguments about freedom of speech are about the free flow of information and how this contributes to democracy. So once again, we're coming back to this idea of what is the relationship between the media and democracy. So the idea that the media are the main channels, the mass media, for want of a better term, are the main channels by which information is disseminated in our society. What is the relationship between that dissemination of information and the health of our democracy? So that's what it's about. It's not about individual liberty. Rather, if we take John Stuart Mill's approach, and Mill, the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, and we're going to return to his ideas throughout this module, freedom of speech is important because it brings us closer to the truth. It brings us closer to the truth. So access to information should not be restricted by the government if we are to properly exercise our rights as citizens. So the government can't deny us access to information because we cannot fulfill our democratic role as citizens. Also, when opinions are freely available and freely accessible, it's actually easier to reject them if we can see the underlying principles. So an open democracy, so a democracy in which ideas are fully and properly explained, makes it easier for democracy to work because we can reject ideas or accept ideas depending on how we evaluate them.